The ISS Meridian smelled like recycled air and anxiety. Marcus Webb stood in the corridor outside the main dining hall, datapad clutched in sweating hands, reviewing Andrali greeting protocols for what had to be the 100th time that week. His left eye twitched. It had been doing that for 5 days straight now, ever since the Andrali delegation had arrived and transformed the ship from diplomatically tense to one wrong word from interstellar incident. 3 weeks. He'd been on this vessel for 3 weeks, surrounded by actual diplomats who spoke 6 languages fluently and never visibly panicked, and somehow Marcus, whose main qualification was didn't immediately offend anyone during screening, had ended up as junior cultural liaison for the most important trade negotiations in recent human history. The datapad chimed with a reminder, formal dinner in 10 minutes. Marcus took a deep breath that did absolutely nothing to calm his nerves and pushed through the doors. The dining hall had been set up for maximum diplomatic carefully. 2 long tables arranged in parallel human delegation on one side, Andrali on the other, with enough space between them to prevent accidental cultural violations, but close enough for conversation. The lighting was adjusted to accommodate Andrali visual preferences, which meant everything looked slightly blue-tinted and made Marcus feel like he was dining in a very expensive aquarium. Ambassador Victoria Peters stood near the human table, projecting her usual aura of, "I could end your career with a single raised eyebrow." She spotted Marcus and made a subtle gesture that clearly meant, "Sit down, shut up, don't embarrass me." Marcus found his assigned seat, safely in the middle of the human delegation, nowhere near anyone important, and tried to look like he belonged there. Around him, senior liaisons and trade specialists made small talk in multiple languages, their confidence making Marcus feel like a child who'd wandered into a corporate board meeting. The Andrali delegation entered in perfect formation, and the room's energy shifted immediately. They moved with a synchronized grace that suggested either extensive practice or mild telepathy, their formal robes flowing like liquid silk. The Andrali were humanoid enough to seem familiar, same basic body structure, same binocular vision, same general proportions. But the differences were impossible to ignore. Their ears rose from their skulls in elegant tapered points, longer than human ears and far more expressive. Their skin had an iridescent quality, shifting subtly in the light, and Marcus had learned that those shifts were emotional signals their species couldn't fully control. Then Princess Kaida entered, and Marcus forgot to breathe for a second. He'd seen her before, obviously. She'd been at every negotiation session, every formal meeting, always composed and articulate and completely terrifying in the way that came from being third in line to rule an interstellar civilization. But he'd always observed from a distance, safely across conference rooms. Up close, she was striking in ways that made Marcus understand why human-Andrali relations required careful cultural navigation. Her skin gleamed with undertones of blue and silver, shifting as she moved. Her ears rose in graceful points that expressed emotions Marcus was still learning to read, and she wore formal robes in deep purple that were absolutely covered in elaborate embroidery. The embroidery, that's what caught Marcus's attention and refused to let go. His briefing materials, incomplete and poorly translated, had mentioned that Andrali formal wear incorporated symbolic languages, ancient patterns that told stories about the wearer's lineage, accomplishments, and social standing. Marcus had spent hours studying what little information was available, trying to decode the basic symbol sets. It was fascinating stuff, linguistic history written in textile, and almost nobody paid attention to it anymore. But Princess Kaida's robes were like a master's thesis in symbolic communication. The patterns were incredibly intricate, clearly combining multiple dialectical traditions, and Marcus found himself trying to parse them as she moved through the room greeting delegates. There, that cluster of interlocking spirals probably indicated ancient lineage, and that geometric pattern might reference military achievement, though the exact translation escaped him. The bottom hem had what looked like agricultural symbols, which seemed odd for royalty unless. Mr. Webb, Ambassador Peters's voice cut through his analysis. The menu. Marcus jerked his attention back to reality, realizing a server was waiting patiently while he stared into space like a malfunctioning robot. Right. Sorry. He glanced at the menu and picked something at random. Dinner began with the kind of formal small talk that made Marcus want to crawl under the table. Multiple courses, each requiring different utensils that Marcus had to identify from memory, because asking would reveal him as the fraud he was. Conversation flowed in Standard and Andrali, the translator devices rendering everything with slight delays that made following along feel like watching a badly dubbed film. Princess Kaida held court at the head of the Andrali table, discussing trade routes with Ambassador Peters. Her voice was clear and confident, her arguments precise, and Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by her diplomatic skill. And every time she gestured, every time she turned to address someone different, her robes shifted to reveal new sections of embroidery, new patterns to decode, new linguistic puzzles to solve. Marcus caught himself staring and forced his attention back to his plate. Right. Professional behavior. He was supposed to be learning by observation, not fixating on textile patterns like some kind of academic obsessive. He lasted approximately 4 minutes before his gaze drifted back. There was a particularly complex pattern near the center of Kaida's back, 3 intersecting symbol sets that seemed to reference both historical events and personal achievement. Marcus squinted slightly, trying to make out the details from across the room. If that symbol meant what he thought it meant, then the surrounding patterns were probably. One of Kaida's security officers, a towering Andrali male whose name Marcus consistently butchered, was staring at him with an expression that clearly communicated, "Stop that immediately." Marcus dropped his gaze back to his plate. His eye twitched harder. The main course arrived, some kind of protein that had been carefully selected to be palatable to both species, served with vegetables Marcus didn't recognize. He ate mechanically, trying to focus on the food, on the conversation happening around him, on literally anything except the embroidered robes. He lasted 7 minutes this time before his academic curiosity overpowered his common sense. Princess Kaida had turned to address someone behind her, and the movement revealed a section of embroidery Marcus hadn't seen before. Those symbols were definitely using the older dialectical structure, the one that predated modern Andrali written language by several centuries. If he could just get a better look. Marcus, the woman next to him, Senior Liaison Rodriguez, whispered urgently, "You're staring." "I'm studying cultural symbols," Marcus whispered back. "You're staring at the princess's back. Stop." But the pattern was right there, and Marcus was so close to understanding what it said. Just another few seconds. Princess Kaida turned abruptly. Their eyes met across the space between tables. Her skin flashed through 3 colors in rapid succession, something pale that might have been surprise, then darker blue that looked like indignation, then a shade Marcus had never seen and couldn't identify. The conversation around them died like someone had cut the audio. Every translator in the room seemed to synchronize, focusing on what was about to happen. Princess Kaida fixed Marcus with a look that made his survival instincts scream. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent dining hall. "Why do you keep looking at my butt, human?" The silence that followed was profound, absolute. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone's brain simultaneously blue screens trying to process what they just heard. Marcus's face achieved temperatures normally associated with small stars. His brain, that magnificent organ responsible for higher reasoning and social navigation, decided this was an excellent time to completely shut down all non-essential functions, like speech, or thought, or the will to live. I wasn't. Words abandoned him entirely. His mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling on dry land. Ambassador Peters's expression suggested she was mentally drafting his termination papers in real time. Several Andrali delegates were making sounds that the translator rendered as suppressed amusement, though a few had given up on suppression entirely and were openly laughing. Princess Kaida's skin had settled on a color somewhere between indignant blue and something darker that Marcus desperately hoped wasn't, preparing to challenge him to ritual combat. "The embroidery," Marcus finally croaked out. His voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "I was looking at the embroidery, the symbolic patterns. I've been studying Andrali linguistic history, and your robes have these incredibly complex symbol sets that combine multiple dialectical traditions. And I was trying to decode what they said because the briefing materials we have are incomplete, and I thought understanding them would help me better understand Andrali cultural context." He was rambling, making it worse. Every word that came out of his mouth sounded more pathetic than the last. "And I wasn't staring at you. I was trying to read your clothes, which I realize sounds creepy now that I say it out loud, but I swear my interest was purely academic and cultural and absolutely not." "Mr. Webb," Princess Kaida's voice cut through his babbling like a knife. "Stop talking." Marcus stopped talking. She stared at him for what felt like several geological ages. Her skin cycled through two more colors Marcus couldn't identify. The other Andrali delegates had gone quiet now, watching their princess with what looked like fascination. Finally, Kaida spoke in careful, measured tones. "We will discuss this later, Mr. Webb, in private." It sounded like a threat. It was definitely a threat. Marcus nodded mutely, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him into the cold vacuum of space. Dinner resumed around them, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Conversations were quieter, more careful. People kept glancing at Marcus when they thought he wasn't looking. Ambassador Peters was having what appeared to be a very tense discussion with her senior staff, all of them studiously not looking in Marcus's direction. Marcus pushed food around his plate without tasting it. His eye wouldn't stop twitching. His career was over. He'd created an interstellar diplomatic incident by accidentally staring at alien royalty's embroidered backside during formal dinner. There was no recovering from this. He'd be lucky if they let him work at a colony mining station after this catastrophe. When dinner finally, mercifully ended, Marcus tried to execute a tactical retreat. He made it approximately 12 meters down the corridor before Ambassador Peters materialized beside him like a particularly angry ghost. "My office, right now." The lecture that followed was comprehensive, devastating, and entirely deserved. Peters cataloged his failures with the precision of someone who'd been mentally composing this speech for hours. Inappropriate attention to visiting dignitaries. Failure to maintain professional boundaries, creating potential diplomatic incidents through sheer social incompetence. The list seemed endless. "I don't care if you were analyzing the molecular structure of her clothing, Webb," Peters said, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. "You don't stare at any part of a princess's body for extended periods during formal dinner. This is basic diplomacy. This is basic human interaction." "But I really was studying the symbolic embroidery," Marcus tried weakly. "I don't care." Peters slammed her hand on the desk. "Do you know what Andrali dueling customs are like? I just spent 20 minutes researching them because I needed to know if we're about to have a formal challenge situation. They involve bladed weapons, Mr. Webb, actual blades." Marcus's remaining color drained from his face. "Your lucky Princess Kaida seems more embarrassed than offended," Peters continued. "Tomorrow, you'll accompany her on a tour of the botanical gardens. You'll apologize, profusely, formally, with absolutely no additional staring at anyone or anything. And if I hear even a whisper of additional inappropriate behavior, I will personally assign you to catalog ice samples on Europa for the rest of your career. Are we crystal clear?" "Crystal clear, Ambassador." Marcus returned to his quarters and spent the next 6 hours lying on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner conversation in excruciating detail. Every replay made it worse. Every remembered detail added new layers of humiliation. His eye twitched relentlessly. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and pulled up every piece of information he could find on Andrali customs, studying with the desperate intensity of someone cramming for an exam that would determine their entire future. Skin color meanings. Amber for amusement, blue for seriousness. Rapid shifting meant embarrassment or uncertainty. Direct eye contact was considered aggressive. Physical touch between non-intimates was inappropriate. Their formal greetings had 17 subtle variations based on context and relative status. None of it would help him fix what he'd broken. When morning finally arrived, Marcus looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. He put on his most formal liaison uniform, practiced his apology 40 times in the mirror, and headed to the botanical gardens with all the enthusiasm of someone walking to their own execution. The gardens were beautiful, multiple biomes featuring plant life from dozens of worlds, all carefully maintained in environmental sections. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have found them fascinating. Today, they felt like the world's prettiest waiting room before a spectacularly uncomfortable conversation. Princess Kaida arrived exactly on time, flanked by 2 security officers who looked capable of folding Marcus into interesting geometric shapes. She wore simpler robes today, still formal, still embroidered but in lighter fabrics. Marcus studiously avoided looking at any part of her clothing. "Princess Kaida," he began, launching into his carefully prepared apology. "I want to express my sincere and profound regret for any offense I caused last night. My behavior was inappropriate, unprofessional, and—" She held up one hand, cutting him off. Her skin was a neutral blue-green. "Walk with me, Mr. Webb. Let us discuss this without an audience." The security officers remained at the entrance. Marcus followed Kaida down a path lined with flowering plants from Rigel IV, his prepared speech evaporating under her silence. They walked past 3 biomes before she spoke. "The embroidery on my robes. You were genuinely trying to read it." Marcus nodded frantically. "Yes, absolutely. The briefing materials mentioned that Andrali formal wear incorporates symbolic languages, ancient patterns that convey lineage and accomplishments. I've been studying what limited information is available, and your robes had these incredibly complex designs that seemed to combine multiple traditions. And I was trying to decode them, because I thought understanding them would help me better understand Andrali culture and diplomatic context. And I realize in retrospect that this looks extremely bad. Like I was just staring at you inappropriately, but I genuinely was trying to read your clothes, which I know sounds creepy." "Mr. Webb," Kaida's voice was gentle but firm. "Breathe." Marcus breathed, took several deliberate breaths while his heart tried to escape his chest. Then Princess Kaida's skin shifted to warm amber and she started laughing. Real, genuine laughter that made her ears twitch in ways Marcus had never seen. "You humans," she said when she could speak again, "are the most awkward species I've ever encountered. And I've negotiated with the Krell, who communicate through interpretive dance." Marcus felt something in his chest unclench slightly. "I've been told we're particularly talented at creating uncomfortable situations." "Exceptionally talented." Kaida's laughter subsided into an amused smile. "You really were trying to study ancient symbolic patterns." "On my life, yes." "Then I'm going to tell you something that may disappoint your academic interests. Most Andrali can't read the old symbolic languages anymore. They've become decorative tradition rather than actual communication. We wear them because our ancestors did, because they're beautiful, because they connect us to history. But the meanings are largely lost." Marcus felt his enthusiasm deflate. "So I was trying to decode something nobody actually uses." Essentially, Kaida gestured to her current robes. This pattern supposedly represents my family accomplishments across 7 generations, as far as anyone can translate, and that translation is hotly debated among the few scholars who still study this. It says something about my great-grandmother killing a space beast in honorable combat. She smiled. My actual great-grandmother was a botanist who developed sustainable crop systems. The most dangerous thing she ever killed was an aphid infestation. Despite everything, Marcus laughed. So I was trying to decode the ancient equivalent of an exaggerated family bumper sticker. Precisely. Kaida's ears twitched with pleasure. But here's what strikes me, Mr. Webb, you were trying. You saw these patterns and wanted to understand them. You studied incomplete databases and academic papers. You cared about our culture enough to look for meaning, even if your execution was. She gestured vaguely. Spectacularly awkward. Awkwardness is becoming my defining characteristic. Embrace it, at least you're memorable. They walked through the gardens for hours, the tension dissolving into something approaching friendship. Kaida explained Andrali customs Marcus had misunderstood. Marcus explained human social norms that had confused her. They laughed about cultural differences and found common ground in shared awkwardness. Then Kaida's security officer appeared, his skin alarm red. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. Kaida's expression went grave. "Someone recorded last night, edited it, leaked it to news outlets across multiple worlds." Her skin darkened. "The negotiations are in jeopardy. We're being recalled to explain ourselves." Marcus's eyes started twitching again. Of course, because things weren't complicated enough already. The emergency joint council session felt less like a diplomatic meeting and more like a trial. The main conference hall had been reconfigured hastily, with both delegations facing each other across a wide table that seemed designed to emphasize the gulf between them. Holographic displays floated above the center, showing the damning edited footage on loop. Marcus looking toward Princess Kaida repeatedly, her turning with visible annoyance. Her accusation cutting through the silence, Marcus's stammering non-response. Without context, it looked exactly as bad as the news outlets were claiming. Marcus stood at one end of the table, feeling like a specimen under examination. The argument escalated rapidly, both sides digging into defensive positions. Other delegates joined in, voices rising in multiple languages, translators struggling to keep pace with increasingly heated exchanges. Marcus watched the diplomatic situation disintegrate in real time and understood with sinking certainty that logic wouldn't save them. The truth had become irrelevant. Politics had taken over, and facts mattered less than perception and wounded pride. He glanced across the room toward Princess Kaida. Her skin was cycling through contemplative shades, her ears angled in a way that suggested she was thinking hard about something. Their eyes met. She gave him the slightest nod, so subtle he almost missed it. Then, before Marcus could process what was happening, Princess Kaida stepped forward from her delegation and reached for the clasps of her formal robes. The reaction was instantaneous and dramatic. Every Andrali in the room gasped, actual sharp intakes of breath that needed no translation. Several human delegates looked confused, uncertain why this mattered. But the High Counselor's expression shifted from anger to something that looked like shocked recognition. Marcus had learned enough over the past day to understand that Andrali royalty never appeared in public without their formal garments. It was a fundamental rule of their social hierarchy, connected to ancient customs about status, dignity, and proper presentation. For a princess to deliberately remove her ceremonial robes in front of a joint diplomatic council was, well, Marcus wasn't entirely sure what it was, but judging by the reactions, it was profoundly significant. Kaida stood in the simple fitted bodysuit that served as underlayer for formal wear, perfectly modest by human standards, but for Andrali cultural sensibilities, this was radical, shocking. Her skin flashed bright amber before settling into serious, determined blue. "I invoke the tradition of Keshvara," she announced clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Absolute honesty without the barriers of formal pretense, as our ancestors spoke when politics obscured truth and ceremony became obstacle rather than bridge. The High Counselor's skin shifted through several rapid colors before settling on resigned blue. "The princess invokes ancient tradition," he said slowly, as if the words cost him something. "We are bound to recognize it." He didn't sound remotely happy about this development. Kaida turned to address both delegations, holding her removed robes in her hands like evidence at a trial. "Here is what actually happened, without political spin or convenient editing. Mr. Marcus Webb was attempting to study the symbolic embroidery patterns on my formal ceremonial wear. These patterns," she displayed the intricate embroidery so everyone could see, "are examples of ancient Andrali linguistic symbols that most of our own people can no longer read or interpret. They've become decorative tradition rather than meaningful communication." She looked directly at the Andrali delegation. Mr. Webb had researched these patterns. He studied what limited information was available in human cultural databases, which is embarrassingly little, I might add, and was genuinely trying to decode them during dinner. His attention was academic. His interest was in understanding our culture at a level deeper than surface pleasantries and diplomatic protocol. Her skin darkened to the most serious blue Marcus had seen. When I saw him looking repeatedly in my direction, I made an assumption based on incomplete understanding of human behavior and social norms. I thought he was staring at me inappropriately. I confronted him publicly, causing embarrassment to both of us and creating this entire situation. She paused, letting that sink in. This human was trying harder to understand our culture than many of our own people do. He was clumsy. Humans are extraordinarily clumsy at interspecies interaction, but his intent was respectful. When I accused him, he didn't become defensive. He didn't make excuses or deflect blame. He attempted to explain, then listened to my concerns, then learned from the experience. Kaida turned to look at Marcus across the room. "In the hours since that dinner, Mr. Webb has taught me more about human social norms, communication styles, and cultural expectations than 3 weeks of briefing materials conveyed. Because we had an actual conversation. An uncomfortable, awkward, deeply embarrassing conversation, but an authentic one." She addressed both delegations again. "Isn't that what we claim to want from interspecies cooperation? People who try to understand even when they fail. People who care enough to study linguistic patterns that most of us have forgotten existed. People who, when confronted with their mistakes, listen and adjust rather than defending their ignorance or dismissing other cultures as incomprehensible." The silence in the room had transformed from hostile to thoughtful. Marcus could see delegates on both sides reconsidering, processing Kaida's words. He found his voice, though his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Princess Kaida is right, I messed up. I've been messing up consistently since I joined this mission." He looked at Ambassador Peters. "I'm not good at diplomacy. I'm awkward, I make incorrect assumptions, I focus on the wrong things at the wrong times. But I'm trying to learn. And the past day has taught me more about successful interspecies communication than years of formal training ever did." Marcus addressed both delegations now, forcing himself to make eye contact even though it felt uncomfortable. Maybe the point isn't to never make mistakes. Maybe it's to create space where mistakes can become conversations instead of conflicts. To assume good intent and work through misunderstandings rather than weaponizing them for political advantage. To choose honest discomfort over polite dishonesty. He gestured between himself and Kaida. "We're from different worlds with different customs and fundamentally different assumptions about what behavior means. We're going to misunderstand each other, repeatedly, probably daily. But this," he indicated the edited recording still looping on the displays, "doesn't have to be a disaster. It can be an example of what happens when people actually choose to communicate." Ambassador Peters looked like she'd swallowed something extremely bitter. But after a long, tense silence during which Marcus could practically hear her recalculating political angles, she nodded slowly. Mr. Webb makes a valid point, however inelegantly expressed. Perhaps we've been so focused on avoiding offense that we've forgotten how to handle it productively when it inevitably occurs. She turned to the Andrali delegation. What if we reframe this incident not as diplomatic failure but as learning opportunity? Demonstrate to our respective populations that human Andrali cooperation can survive misunderstandings, even public, embarrassing ones, when both sides choose honest communication. The High Counselor's skin shifted to a lighter, more considering shade of blue. The princess's judgment in invoking Keshvara carries significant weight in our culture, and her personal assessment that this human's intentions were respectful. He inclined his head toward Kaida with obvious respect for her boldness. If Princess Kaida believes Mr. Webb's cultural curiosity was genuine, I am inclined to accept that assessment. He looked at Marcus with an expression that might have been the beginning of approval, though perhaps future cultural studies could be conducted with slightly more discretion and less public attention. Absolutely, Marcus agreed fervently. All the discretion, maximum discretion. I will become the most discreet cultural researcher in the history of interspecies relations. Several delegates made sounds that might have been laughter. The tension in the room didn't vanish entirely. Decades of diplomatic training prevented that, but it eased considerably, like pressure releasing from a sealed container. Both sides began discussing how to address the leaked recording publicly, how to reframe the incident for their respective populations. Someone suggested a joint statement about the importance of direct communication in diplomatic relations. Someone else proposed having Marcus and Kaida give interviews explaining what they'd learned from their misunderstanding. The conversation shifted from damage control to opportunity management. Kaida, still standing in her undergarments with formal robes draped over one arm, caught Marcus's eye across the room. Her skin flashed bright amber, pure amusement. She mouthed something that looked like "You're welcome," or possibly "You owe me forever." Marcus mouthed back "Thank you," with as much gratitude as he could convey through facial expression alone. The meeting eventually adjourned. As people filed out, still discussing implementation details, Marcus found himself approached by one of the senior Andrali scholars, an elderly female whose skin was a contemplative green. "Mr. Webb," she said, in heavily accented standard, "I understand you've been studying symbolic embroidery languages." Yes, trying to anyway. The available materials are limited." "Come to the homeworld," she interrupted, her ears expressing what looked like excitement. "We have archives, primary sources. Nobody's shown genuine interest in decades. Most young people think it's boring historical nonsense." Her skin brightened. "You could actually read the old texts, help translate them properly. Make them accessible again." Marcus blinked. "Seriously? Seriously, turn your embarrassing dinner incident into something useful." She handed him a contact code. "We'll arrange it." Over the following days, as the meridian continued toward the Andrali homeworld, Marcus's life transformed in ways he never could have predicted. The negotiations resumed with new understanding and only moderately elevated awkwardness. He'd somehow gone from junior liaison who nearly destroyed interstellar relations to symbol of cultural bridge building through authentic communication and willingness to look foolish in pursuit of understanding. It was absurd, terrifying, more responsibility than he was remotely qualified for, but people had stopped looking at him like a walking diplomatic disaster, so he'd take it. "You're famous now," Kaida told him one afternoon as they sat in the observation lounge, comparing notes over terrible ship coffee. "The human who stared at my butt and accidentally promoted peace between our peoples. Very heroic. I'm thinking of commissioning a statue." "That is absolutely not how I want to be remembered by history," Marcus protested. "Too late. Maybe a commemorative plaque with detailed embroidery carved into bronze. Something tasteful yet mortifying. I genuinely hate you sometimes. Kaida's skin flashed amber. No, you don't. She was right. Over their remaining time aboard ship, they developed an unlikely friendship built on shared embarrassment, and the unique bond that forms between people who have survived mutual catastrophe together. Kaida taught him more Andrali customs, correcting his pronunciation with only moderate mockery. No, it's Kreshtiah, not Kreshta. You're asking about someone's grandmother instead of greeting them. Try again. Marcus explained human social cues that had confused her delegation. Why humans smile when uncomfortable. Why they use so many words when direct statements would be more efficient. Why they find certain questions invasive that Andrali consider perfectly normal. Your species is obsessed with where people look, Kaida observed one evening. You have entire social hierarchies built around gaze direction and duration. It seems exhausting. It is, Marcus admitted, but it's also useful. You can learn a lot about someone by where they choose to look, what captures their attention, whether they meet your eyes or avoid them. Unless they're trying to read historical linguistic patterns on formal wear. Obviously, that's the exception. They laughed, comfortable in ways Marcus hadn't expected to feel with anyone on this voyage, much less with alien royalty he'd accidentally offended. On their final evening before reaching the Andrali homeworld, Marcus found Kaida in the observation lounge again, watching stars wheel past in their patient dance. He joined her without speaking, and they sat in companionable silence for several minutes. Nervous about going home, Marcus asked eventually. A little, Kaida admitted. We've accomplished something significant on this voyage, but implementing these agreements will be challenging. There are factions that oppose any human alliance. She glanced at him. What about you? First time visiting an alien homeworld. First time doing anything remotely this important, Marcus said. I'm fairly certain they assigned me to this mission by mistake, and everyone's been too polite to correct the error. Kaida's skin shifted to warm amber. They didn't make a mistake. You're terrible at traditional diplomacy, truly catastrophically bad, but you're excellent at being genuine. That matters more than people realize. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my complete lack of professional competence. Don't let it inflate your ego. She paused, her skin shifting to a color Marcus was learning meant she was building up to something. So, when we reach my world, you'll need to tour the royal palace. Standard diplomatic protocol. Fair warning, the throne room has even more elaborate embroidery than my dinner robes. Historical tapestries covering every surface depicting our civilization's entire history. Very important cultural artifacts. Marcus looked at her carefully. Her skin was shifting between amber and something softer, more blue. Are you giving me permission to study cultural artifacts? I'm giving you explicit authorization to examine historical textiles for as long as you deem academically necessary, Kaida said with mock formality. Strictly for educational purposes, obviously. Obviously. Marcus couldn't quite suppress his smile. Purely academic interest in historical symbolic linguistics and textile patterns. Exactly. They were both grinning like idiots. Behind them, through the observation windows, Earth and the Andrali homeworld shone in their respective corners of space. Different, distant, but connected now by trade agreements, diplomatic channels, and two people who'd met through spectacular misunderstanding, and somehow found genuine friendship. Hey, Kaida, Marcus said, yes. When we get to the throne room, if I do accidentally focus too intently on something culturally sensitive, maybe just tell me directly, preferably before announcing it to everyone within earshot. Her skin flashed brilliant amber. Where would be the fun in that? I'm serious. My cardiovascular system can only handle so many public accusations. Fine, I'll limit public callouts to a reasonable number. Maybe only 2 or 3 per major diplomatic function. You're the worst. and yet somehow still your favorite person on this ship. She wasn't wrong. Marcus had worked with countless diplomats who were technically competent, professionally appropriate, and utterly forgettable. Kaida was none of those things. She was bold, occasionally inappropriate, frequently alarming, and somehow she'd become one of his favorite people across 2-star systems. The ISS Meridian continued its journey toward the Andrali homeworld, carrying its cargo of trade goods, diplomatic agreements, and 2 unlikely friends who represented something new in human-alien relations. Not perfect harmony, but honest connection, built on misunderstanding and awkwardness, and the shared recognition that sometimes caring enough to look foolish is more valuable than maintaining perfect diplomatic composure. Marcus still made mistakes constantly, still mispronounced Andrali phrases and used culturally inappropriate gestures, and occasionally focused too intently on textile patterns that turned out to be less significant than he thought. But now when it happened, Kaida just laughed and corrected him, and added it to her growing mental list of endearing human disasters. And Marcus had learned something invaluable about interspecies relations. Perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was. Understanding was. Being willing to try, fail, apologize, and try again. That was what actually mattered. When they finally reached the Andrali homeworld and descended through its atmosphere toward the capital city, Marcus pressed his face against the viewport like an excited child. Kaida sat beside him, pointing out landmarks and explaining their significance, her skin shifting through pleased amber tones. "Ready for your next diplomatic adventure?"